So I'm going to talk about what it takes to lead a remarkable life, and I think that ultimately there's a lot of people have a lot of different measures on what they want out of education. I don't want to tell people what they should want for their children, but I do think that a remarkable life should be something that every person strives for. And so one of the things that I came up with as far as my sort of model for what allows a young person to lead a remarkable life are two primary ingredients. One is happiness, and one is accomplishment. And happiness is something that you'll hear a lot within the homeschooling circles and the unschooling circles. In the first presentation, it was pretty prominent on that slide. And I think that's really critical. And then accomplishment is something that people tend to focus more in traditional schools, down the traditional paths, although the measure of accomplishment within those arenas, I think, are skewed and off as far as what is best for children. But I'm going to talk about both of those in terms of how that can help children lead remarkable lives. So first with the happiness. The first thing is that money doesn't buy happiness. This is something that we've all heard many times before. However, money can give you access to things that allow you to be happier. It's kind of hard to really be happy if you live in abject poverty, for example. And as the comedian Bill Hicks once said, money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you a jet ski. And have you ever met anyone who was unhappy on a jet ski? But there's research behind happiness as well. And the one thing that they found is that once you get beyond about $50,000 per year, generally in the United States, that it doesn't really matter how much money you make. So the happiness level between people who make $50,000 a year and $5 million a year are about on par. So money is important to get you out of a really bad situation, to get you to where you don't have to worry about the next meal, about heating your house, about making sure your children are clothed. But beyond that, money becomes a lot less important. And the latest research shows that the variance in happiness, and there's big swings in happiness throughout the population, but the variance in happiness can be explained in three parts: genetic, environmental, and a mindset or approach to life. And so genetic the variance that's attributed to genetic is about 50%. And that's something that we just can't control. So the differences in happiness between different people, 50% of that is actually genetic. Surprisingly, only 10% is environmental. And so we oftentimes, at least I oftentimes, would think that if only I was in a better situation, if only I had more money, if only I was more successful, if only this, if only that, if only I had a girlfriend, if only I had a children or something like that, I would be happier. But 10%, only 10% of the variance is actually attributed to environmental factors. The other 40% is driven by your mindset or approach to life. And if we're trying to get children to lead remarkable lives, I think it's really, really important that we think about how can we maximize their happiness. And that mindset that they bring to the table of their life is really critical. And when they really dove down into that 40% of mindset, they found that there were three primary drivers into how to maximize this mindset. The first one is being thankful or having gratitude, just in general in life. So instead of looking at why things aren't so good, it's just being really appreciative of the things that one has. And that's something that we as parents can certainly try to model for our children, just being thankful for what we have. Another part is being part of a community. And it's really hard, I think, in the United States these days because we're a very mobile society. We tend to not latch on to communities. We tend to reject it almost. We have this very individualistic nature in the United States. And so sometimes that pushes us away from communities. But being part of a community, whether it's a spiritual community, whether it's some sort of geographic community, whatever it may be, that is really critical to being able to affect that mindset or approach to life that drives so much happiness. And then the third one is something that I think really shocks people, because we think of happiness, it's a very selfish thing to want to be happy, and how do I maximize my happiness? But the third driver is actually the opposite of selfishness. It's actually doing things for others. So it's the notion that I'm going to do something for someone else, and then that will somehow increase my happiness. And that's what they found. And so happiness is something that I think a lot of unschoolers get right. And a lot of people unschool specifically for the reason that they want their kids to be happy. And I think that's great. I think that's part of the equation for these kids to live a remarkable life. The other half of the equation is accomplishment. And this is where I think I'll probably get some disagreement in this room, at least initially, is that accomplishment is vital to being able to lead a remarkable life. And people measure accomplishment in various ways. They can measure it in academic terms, professional terms, financial terms, and then I'll add my fourth sort of measure of accomplishment later. So first I'm going to talk about academic. There's a lot of parents out there who think that if their kids just get into Harvard or Stanford, that they're successful. And one of the previous speakers mentioned something about, they don't know of any parent who doesn't think that what was on that list is what would make them a good parent. But the reality is, I actually talk to parents all the time, and a lot of parents measure their worth as a parent in terms of how successful they will be at getting their kids into certain schools. And it's really sad and disappointing, but it's true. And we have this mindset in the United States, well, it's a global mindset, thanks to the United States, that if we just work hard enough, if we just study hard enough and we do what's necessary, do our homework, jump through all the hoops, and we get straight A's, then we can get to the top of the heap in high school, and that will allow us to get into a really great, amazing college. Unfortunately, then when they get to college, everyone who's there typically has already done that, and so then they have to start over again. And then they have to work really hard, study really hard, make sure that they go to neurotic levels of editing on various book research papers and whatnot, drill problems for engineering sets, so that they can get to the top of their class in college. And if they do that, then they'll be lucky enough to get into a really great graduate school. And so this competition that, they're competing in this academic world and they're trying to get to the top. By the time they get into grad school, they have to keep doing that. And if they're really successful, then they'll get a good job. And so, unfortunately, when we look at it in that way, we're measuring all these kids on one academic measure, and that academic measure is a GPA, right? And it's associated with certain brands to certain schools. And any system that measures everyone by the same measure is ultimately going to lead to a lot of losers and not very many winners. So that system ultimately deems the majority of society as a loser. And that's a really unhealthy thing for children, I think, which is pretty obvious. Even the winners, though, lose out in such a system, right? The people who play the game and play the game well, they get to the top. They get to, Harvard or Stanford. They get to the top. They may even win a Marshall Scholarship or a Rhodes Scholarship. They go study at Oxford or Cambridge, and then they come back, and then they go to Yale Law School, and they've worked their butts off their entire lives and their entire youth. And then at the end of it all, what have they accomplished? What they've typically done is they've dumbed themselves down. They focus their learning on very narrow guidelines that are measured by other people. And they've given up on what it was that they might have actually wanted to do with their lives. So there's so many people that go to Yale Law School who had these great notions of what they were going to do for society, and then they go and end up working for a big law firm in New York City, and they just threw it all away. And they're successful by in the terms that we as society measure them academically, but I would hardly call that success. Peter Thiel, who's an amazing entrepreneur and investor, in his new book, 0 to 1, which I encourage people to read, especially the entrepreneurs out there, he had this really good comment about this academic fight that everyone's on, and how that oftentimes leads people to move away from what their passion is or to where they want to go. And he said, every Rhodes Scholar had a great future in their past. So academic measurement, academic achievement is one way in which we as a society measure achievement. Another one is professional, and this oftentimes goes hand in hand with the academic, unfortunately. And so it's pretty well understood that some of the most valued companies in the world, that people want to work for the most, are companies like Apple, but amongst the Ivy League crowd, it's McKinsey Consulting and Goldman Sachs, or big law firms. Some people want to become doctors. Some people want to become professors at top research universities. All of these professions, they require the people who want to be successful in those professions to go down very prescribed pathways. And there's things that one must do to get in the door in these professions. Oftentimes that requires them to play the game in college. And so the professional and academic are quite tied. To be successful in the eyes of many in society, you have to play that game, the academic and professional. But unfortunately, if you go down that path, you're often going to go very far away from who you are as a person and what you want to contribute to the world. Financial is another measure of achievement or accomplishment that is also tied to the first two. So it's very difficult in our society to make a really large income if you don't play the game, if you don't go to certain schools, if you don't get into certain professions. There's always exceptions, the most obvious one being entrepreneurship, which you don't have to play the game, which I encourage for a lot of people. Or sales, so if you're a great salesperson, you can certainly circumvent that. But the surest way for most of society to reach financial security at a minimum, at least in the mindset of most people in society, is to go down this path of trying to gain academic and professional accomplishment. The one that I don't think is talked about enough in terms of accomplishment, and the one that I think actually will drive a much more remarkable life for children and also play back into the happiness loop, is contribution to the world. And I think that people who contribute to the world, who try to get away from this notion of competing with everyone, but instead they want to create for the world, they want to create for others, I think that that is a level of accomplishment that we might want to promote and that we might want to cheer on. It's something that's a lot more difficult to measure. You can't just measure it by a 4.0 or a 1600. And when you're creating, it's not as easy to put up these hurdles or these screens or filters that they have for companies such as Goldman or McKinsey, where you have to go through multiple interview rounds. When you create something, you're creating something new. It's something that's never been done before, typically. It's something that you have to go out there and prove to the world that it's of value. You have to convince consumers or supporters or donors to buy into it. And so that's really, really hard. It's hard to measure that. But if we can go ahead and promote that as accomplishment, I think that will allow a lot more children to lead remarkable lives if we can go ahead and distance ourselves from the previous three. Just some ways that young people can contribute to the world, and old people, is they can improve the lives of others by addressing social ills. And so we know that we as humans have a long way to go to become a truly enlightened, caring, compassionate, fair, egalitarian society, right? And so there's certainly social ills that need to be addressed that aren't being addressed very well. And we can serve others through market functions. So this is the business entrepreneurs out there, people like Elon Musk. You know, he goes out there and he tries to improve the world through companies that he starts. And if he's successful, he's going to do a lot more to help address, for example, global climate change than any legislation would through his various efforts with Tesla and the solar panel companies. There's creating knowledge for the sake of humanity. So people who research, not because they're trying to get published and get tenure at certain universities, but because they fundamentally care about an issue so much that they're willing to dedicate their lives to researching and trying to expand the knowledge base of human beings for the benefit of society. Another way is making the world more beautiful through art, music or visual art or performance art. You know, there are ways in which people can actually make the world a better place for others simply through their creative contributions. So how do we help children then live remarkable lives, understanding that happiness and accomplishment are two critical components, the two most critical components in my eyes. And the traditional schooling path, the traditional college path is the one that most people are going to lean back on. As I said earlier though, the problem with using standardized context as a way to get someone to lead a remarkable life is that you're going to create a lot more losers in the process than winners. You know, if we measure everyone by their willingness to spend hours editing and re-editing an essay that they don't care about, that they have to write in order to get a good grade so that they can maintain that 4.0, what we're doing is we're taking them away from things that really matter to them. If they need to work on their multiplication table, you know, for hours and hours at a time, think about what they're losing in terms of opportunity cost. What could they be doing if they weren't doing that? I get people into Harvard and Stanford. This is something I've been doing for years. Parents come to me and they pay me a lot of money to get them into Harvard or Stanford or another Ivy League school. Unfortunately, that's how I can reach children. It's not good enough for me to say, I can help your children lead remarkable lives. You know, allow me to work with your child and I can let them, you know, world of opportunities will open up to them. They'll be able to create a wonderful life for themselves. They'll be able to figure out what they want to do for the rest of their lives while they're still young and then become an expert at, you know, by their early 20s. That just doesn't sell very well. So what I say is, I'll get them into Harvard or Stanford, and then they come after me and throw money at me. But when they come to me, and when they actually retain me, then what I do is I then work on helping that child live a remarkable life. Because surprise, surprise, as you said earlier, these colleges, they recognize children who are amazing when they see them. These schools don't want to accept people who have 4.0s and 2,400 SATs. That's not what they're really after. They're looking for people who are going to make their university great and who are going to go out and have wonderful lives. And what's the best way to determine if someone's going to have a great future and they're going to contribute greatly to the world? You know, well, GPAs, SATs, they don't quite cut it. But if the child is living a remarkable life and already creating, already doing amazing things, then it's a lot easier for them to get in. And so that's also like my secret when I'm working with these kids. You have all these people who are admissions consultants and they focus on the SAT and GPA. Meanwhile, I tell the kids to drop out of school and do something great. And they do better.
Create robots.
What's that?
Harvard creates robots.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I agree with that Harvard creates robots. I think that the output is robots because the input is robots.
Right.
And I think that people who go to universities like Harvard or Stanford, who know what they want to do with their life, and they have a purpose and a passion and a mission, then when they get to a school like that, ignoring that there are some required courses, they're able to really dive in and invest themselves in that whatever passion of theirs is, and then they can come out the other end much better trained, more enlightened, more eager, with a better view of the world. But the problem is that so many robots go in, and then unfortunately, when you're in there and you've played the game your entire life to get into Harvard, then you're already of that mindset. I have to keep playing the game. Now I want to go to Stanford Business School or Harvard Law School. You know, now what do I have to do now to get into McKinsey or Goldman? Well, you got to get a 4.0. You got to put aside your passions so you can go ahead and pursue some external measure of success. So what I do when I work with kids is I help them identify their needs, goals, and interests. I ask them, how are you going to satisfy those needs, goals, and interests? And then I ask them, how can I help them? And this is something that everyone can do. And I don't want to put down people who have their kids in traditional schools, private schools, or public schools. For some parents, that's the best that they can do right now, and that's fine. I think that there's a lot of things that families can do to try to overcome those constraints, such as move into a smaller house or whatnot. But people live within the constraints of their life, and they do the best that they can do. But recognizing that every single person is resource constrained, I think it's really important that we ask ourselves. This is why I ask myself. This is why I try to get parents to ask themselves and learners to ask themselves is, what are my constraints and what resources do I have available? And by far the biggest constraint that everyone has is not money. It's not money, it's time, right? Time is the biggest constraint that every person has. It's the only resource that constantly dwindles away. We can accumulate cash throughout our lives. We can't accumulate time. Every single second that passes is one less second in our life. And I think that's really important that we acknowledge that and we understand that time is our most precious and most fleeting resource, and we have to take advantage of that. So how do learners go ahead and maximize their resources, knowing that time is ever dwindling and that if they don't do something now, it may not ever get done? They have to rely on community, and so when I work with learners, I'm trying to help them figure out how to move forward in their educational paths. But I'm not enough for them, right? I encourage them to identify who is my community and how can they help me. Obviously, the parents are part of that community. It's the one that most of them think about immediately. They're the ones who feed them and clothe them, so that makes the most sense. But if these learners can build communities around themselves with other people other than family and other than teachers or consultants, then all of a sudden they're opening up a lot more resources to themselves. And so I think of neighbors, I think of extended family, I think of local community leaders, church leaders, local business owners, local artists and tradespeople. All these people are potential resources to kids. And for grown-ups, for us grown-ups, it's really hard for us to make those connections. It's really hard for me to go down the street, say I wanted to learn how to bake something, because I can't bake. I go to a local bakery and I was like, hey, is it okay if I just drop by and hang out in the kitchen and learn how to bake? And the answer is obviously going to be no, but we, as human beings, we love helping kids. Like, we go out of our way to help kids. And so if kids simply, young people, I actually don't like the word kids, young people, if they would simply realize that people are potential resources and they can build a community, a learning community around themselves, then they have much more than anyone could get out of even the best, most expensive private prep schools, $30,000, $40,000 a year prep schools, because you can actually access tradespeople and entrepreneurs and community leaders who will actually be invested in your success in the future. And there's a lot of great teachers out there, but it's really hard for teachers who are forced or choose to be in a classroom with kids who are forced to be there to really care fundamentally about all 30 or 120 of their kids, especially the ones who are the least likely to behave in class because the school is failing them the most. And so if we can simply acknowledge that and allow, instead of the kid being forced to be associated with a certain resource provider, allowing the learner to identify who their resource providers are, then that learner is going to get a lot more out of them. The final thing that we have to do in order to try to help our young people lead remarkable lives is to give them the time and space to live remarkable lives. Now this is where I'll come in and I'll say something negative about the schools again. Schools lock children in to a geographic location, typically for 6 to 7 hours a day, typically 180 days a year, typically 13 years of their young life. Not all schools are bad, and there's a lot of great teachers out there, but whenever you take away the freedom for a child to focus in on what they want to do with their life and pursue their passions and really live what they believe is a remarkable life, because you're saying, okay, you can live a remarkable life, but it has to be outside of this, block of time, only on the weekends, then when they're freed of those constraints, then they'll have an opportunity to really build skills and experiences that allow them to move towards that remarkable life, position. If we don't give them that space and time, then what we do is we fall back into, unfortunately, the position that most of us have, or most of us as a society have for kids. It's like, yeah, you can live a remarkable life when you're 22, or when you're 27. And the thing is that human beings, we're a learning species, right? And if we learn early on that a remarkable life isn't an option for us, and that we just have to play the game, or we have to play by the rules, then when it comes 22 or 27, when they get out of grad school or whatever age it is, that we say, okay, now you can lead a remarkable life, they've already lost that love of learning. They've already lost that desire to lead a remarkable life. And so I just like to encourage everyone to recognize that children can lead remarkable lives. Every person's life is heavily influenced by the people around them, especially their parents. And so when you focus on their happiness and their accomplishment, and you give them the space to lead a remarkable life, they're much likely to get there. The fact that you all are here says a lot about you as parents. You obviously care enough to ask the questions, what is it that I can do for my children? And you're obviously willing to, if not leave the traditional school setting entirely, you're at least willing to ask, well, what other type of settings are possible for my children? And so I think that that's amazing. Now I hope that you guys will go ahead and now focus on allowing them to lead remarkable lives through accomplishment, and by allowing them to lead remarkable lives through happiness. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys may have.
You said there was 3 things: academic, financial, and there was something else. What's it? Professional. That's what it was.
Yeah.
So those are levels of achievement, right?
Accomplishment as termed by our society. Those are societal expectations or societal measures of achievement or accomplishment. I don't think that those are the only ones.
Oh, no,
yeah.
no, I'm not disagreeing with that. I have a question. So like the Card Academy, which is amazing, and some of these other homeschool schools. Mm-hmm. So you help kids get into Harvard, these Ivy League schools. So how do you do that when you have kids that are homeschooled? And a lot of schools, I know I have some of my sisters are trying to get into Harvard and different schools, and they require for you to be summa cum laude and all these things, and have to be the captain of the boys club, captain of the Spanish club, captain of all these clubs, and all these requirements, because these academic acceptance people over there at Harvard, and I agree with you, that these schools are looking for kids that are extraordinary, that stand out, that want to have an extraordinary life. And I think that the only way to have a really extraordinary life, and one of the easiest paths to that is unschooling or homeschooling or things like that, right? But how do you get these kids? And I'm sorry, I'm just you seem like a really good expert at getting these kids into these Ivy League schools or into a good, accomplished, recognized school like Stanford University, San Jose. How do you do that when you have homeschooling from grade school all the way through high school?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to recognize is the reason why they expect you to be valedictorian, 4.0, 2400 SAT is because that's what most kids do. And the best way they can show that they're the best is to be perfect according to the standard formula that every kid is forced to be a part of. The reality is, though, is that Harvard and Stanford and these other top schools, they don't really like these 4.0, 2400 SATs, captain of 3 sports teams, presidents of 3 clubs, because it's not hitting what they really want in a class. Every school has various sort of interests when they're constructing their class. They have legacies that they have to worry about, recruited athletes, children of professors, development cases. So just ignore those. I'm gonna assume that none of you guys are billionaires or senators, right? Get rid of those, or professors at Stanford. But the rest of the people who are applying for those schools, they have to show that they are the best and the brightest. But most of them, they live in this traditional school world, and the best way they can show that they're the best and brightest is simply to be perfect, within that context. But every school prioritizes 3 things, and they may use different terms for it, every top school: diversity, intellectual vitality, and excellence. Diversity is something that very few people can control. It's what you're born with. It's a socioeconomic condition that you live in. It's who your parents are. It's what race you are. It's whether or not you've had a disease growing up. That's diversity. You can't control that. They're looking for diversity to build a really amazing class. They're looking for intellectual vitality. Intellectual vitality isn't the ability to get a 2400 on the SAT or a 4.0 GPA. Intellectual vitality is a yearning desire to understand the world around you and to try to find solutions to that world. And that can be measured in, I'm going to do research into something I really care about. It can be measured in, here's a social problem, I'm going to create an organization to take it on, to help address this need. It can be, I see a market opportunity, so I'm going to create a company. That's what intellectual vitality is. And the reality is, most kids with a 2400 SAT and a 4.0 don't top the charts in intellectual vitality, because what they're doing is they're playing someone else's game. They're doing what they're expected to, and they're working really hard, in this sort of formula that they've been given. Stanford measures intellectual vitality on a scale, I think 1 to 5, and if you top out that scale, you're pretty much guaranteed in. It doesn't matter if you have a 2.5 GPA or a 1200 SAT. If you get a 5 on the intellectual vitality score for Stanford, you're virtually a lock to get into that school. Most people who apply who are valedictorians, and there's over 30,000 valedictorians every year, and who have 4.0s and have 2400 SAT, they don't get a 5 when Stanford measures their intellectual vitality. Intellectual vitality means the kid loves learning so much, and they have this desire to understand the world around them so much that they pursue opportunities to try to address those. In a traditional school context, they just don't have the freedom to do that. They're going to be doing that stuff after they get out of school and after they do their homework, and then they're going to be spending their time on the weekends doing it. They just don't have the time to do it. Homeschoolers and unschoolers have all the time in the world to focus in on what they care about the most. So it's much easier. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, because there's a lot of homeschoolers who simply don't demonstrate it. They just go through the motions as well. But the ones who really embrace that opportunity to pursue their passions, they top the charts on intellectual vitality, which all the top schools care about. And then the third measure, which is extremely important to these schools, is excellence, the notion of excellence. And excelling, by playing the game that everyone else plays, is extremely hard. There's only 1 valedictorian in each school. I mean, unless they have co-valedictorians, right? But there's 33,000 valedictorians in the country each year. But it's very hard to get to the top, and then you have to get to the top of the SATs and the SAT2s. You have to be in more clubs than other people. You have to be in more sports. You have to gain more awards from teachers. It's very hard to become the best in a school, especially when you're being measured on things that you don't really care about. Most kids who get 4.0s, they don't love learning. They love getting A's because there's external validation for it. But if kids can focus in on what they really care about, their passions, and they can pursue it with vigor, and they can create wonderful lives for themselves with wonderful outcomes, they demonstrate excellence very easily. So if I say that I want to go to college and eventually become a doctor so that I can go around the world with, and fix kids with some sort of terrible physical deformation or something, right? So, I can say that, and I can say, and here's my grades to prove it, and I'm the president of these 3 clubs, and I was a letterman in 3 different sports, and then over here's a homeschool learner who said, yeah, I want to do this, and oh, by the way, what I've been doing for the last 2 years is I've been taking trips to India, and I've been working with Doctors Without Borders. I can't operate on people, but I can go there and support, and I've been doing, I've been interning at the local research hospital or whatever. They can demonstrate and they can build a resume which shows, that they can perform at a very high level in areas that they care about. And it's just much easier for people to be really good at something that they really care about. So, do you want to play the game, or do you want to be able to circumvent the game, right? If you go within a traditional school to get to the top, you have to work really hard. You have to be neurotic about it, and you have to care about stuff that's absolutely worthless, right? Cover page. Okay, so I'm going to spend an hour on a cover page, just to get a 100 on my report. So they can focus on that, or they can focus on building an amazing life for themselves around stuff that they really care about, and then they can demonstrate excellence really easily because they're going to rise to the top because the rest of society is still playing this archaic, old, traditional school game. So it's actually much easier for people to get into these top colleges if they're homeschooled. Unfortunately, most of the homeschool community doesn't understand how important intellectual vitality and excellence are to be able to demonstrate that. And if they did, it would change things. One of my goals, I do not think everyone needs to go to college. I actually think college is a really bad option for most people. I think that for some people, it's a great option. And for some people, depending on what they want to do, it can really open up a lot of doors. My goal is, within the next decade, to help free millions of people from coercive schools so they can build their own lives and create really wonderful lives for themselves while they're still young, which means that they'll live great lives in the future. My goal is not to get a bunch of people into Harvard and Stanford and other top schools, but within the next 10 years, I would like to start seeing an overrepresentation of homeschoolers and alternative schoolers in these schools. Currently, there's not because these schools don't want them, but simply because because people just aren't taking advantage of it. One example is people think that Harvard's really expensive. I'm a homeschooler. I'm going to allow my kid to take some courses at the local community college, and then they can transfer in for the last 2 years at a big state school, and I'll save a bunch of money. If you make less than $100,000 a year, it's probably cheaper for you to go to Harvard than it is to go to University of California school. It's just the way it is. They have such amazing financial aid that if you make less than $100,000 as a family and you go to Harvard, it's cheaper than most other schools. So I would actually like to see that number expand greatly. And when that number expands greatly, that's going to allow much more of society whose sole focus is on getting their kids in the top schools to realize, oh, wait a second, I wasn't really concerned about this whole idea of letting them have a wonderful childhood, but if they can get into a top school by going down this alternative path, then I'll consider it, and in that way we can help free many, many more children from these schools.
J. Paul Getty and Andrew Carnegie said that if you go to college, you lessen your chance of becoming a millionaire by 90%.
Yeah. Another thing is that I encourage people, after they get into Harvard or Stanford, if they want to be entrepreneurs, to drop out their first semester. Because then you get the branding benefit without having wasted those years. Yeah.
I would like, I feel like there's some knocks right now, because as a parent, you want all this for your child, but you talked about diversity, where the parent came from and what skills they have and abilities, and the fear that the homeschooler, Art Academy talked about. It's about
Yeah, no,
What are the practical ways that we as parents, we're not here as parents, how can we do that?
yeah, it's really hard. And like I said, I really respect so many teachers. So many teachers put their heart and soul into their kids. And so I used to be in the camp of blaming teachers for the problems in American education. I simply do not anymore. But there's a lot of things people can do to try to facilitate a great learning experience for their children. Just because schools operate, from 7 to 3 or whatever, doesn't mean that's when the kid has to be engaged in whatever it is that we think is education. So in your case, you're a teacher, you have to be at school, that's how you pay the bills. Is there any way that your child can be taken care of by someone else during those hours where they're free to pursue their interests? So not a daycare, not some other school, but a special relationship that you create with neighbors, other parents who want to, you can create like essentially a cooperative, where you guys take turns taking care of these, of the young people while they can pursue their interests and passions. The average kid only receives 2 to 2.5 hours of instruction per day in school, even though they're there for 6 to 7 hours. And so even if you want to stick to the notion that they need to learn certain things and that they have to follow some curriculum, which I don't believe, but even if you do believe that, there's no reason why they can't do that at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the evening or on the weekends. They would still get more book time, per se.
It's also more than trusted ourselves as parents.
Right.
So like that we can go.
Yeah.
Right now it's a community. It's
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
But I know after school I do my thing. I spend less hockey, learning about the states and the countries, where they're located and where they're from. So I'm doing what I can to homeschool in a way after school, but to let go, like you guys are saying, to unschool and to make them an amazing person.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. The one thing, we think of unschooling or homeschooling or alternative schooling as radical in our society, only because it's a radical departure from the status quo. But in terms of what we know about education, psychology, just psychology in general, sociology, education theory, is traditional schooling, coercive schooling, we know that it's bad for kids. We know that it undermines learning. We know that it inhibits learning. We know that it's bad, it's detrimental to motivation. It has negative, long-term negative outcomes, both socially and emotionally. So it's just being willing to sort of acknowledge, what we do know about learning, and taking that step. The one thing that holds a lot of parents back is, and they may not admit it, and I'm not saying that you do this, but this is a lot of parents. They say, you know what? If I take this risk and my kids fail, everyone's going to look at me like I ruined my kid's future. However, if I stay with the status quo and they fail, no one can point a finger at me because I didn't do anything different. And the reality is that their chances of failure, as a person, within life, skyrocket when we take away their freedom to lead remarkable lives and we force them into a coercive situation. And so it's a big block, it's a big mental block. But the people who do it now are making it that much easier for people in the future. The homeschoolers of the 70s and 80s, the ones who went out there when everyone ridiculed them, they've made it so much easier for the people today. And the people who do it today are going to make it so that in 20 or 30 years, the expectation is that you don't put your kid into a course of school unless you have absolutely no choice, unless you're being forced to by the state or some other external circumstance. Yeah. Yeah. So the first thing I would do is read a lot, right? There's just a ton of research out there learning research and books. If you don't want to actually read research, but there's just a tremendous amount to learn through reading and educating yourself that will just help you tear down a lot of your inhibitions and your fears about going down this more unstructured path. So I think that's one. The second thing is that the homeschooling community in general is very inclusive, and there's certain pockets. Like I live in Austin, Texas, so there's a big secular community that is kind of not as parts of it can be not as welcoming to Christian homeschoolers or religious homeschoolers, and then there's also parts of this country where if you're not religious, then they're not exactly welcoming to you either. But in general, most homeschoolers, they're fanatical about it. They just sing the praises of the ability of people to be able to raise their children and teach them or allow them to learn at home. And you should just reach out to your local homeschooling groups. There's going to be great mentors within those groups, people who are just eager to help out. In a lot of homeschooling groups, there's people who've homeschooled their kids, and their kids went off and got married, and now they're helping homeschool the grandkids, and they just keep up with it because they just love it so much. And so you'll be able to find mentors, through local homeschooling groups and Yahoo groups.
Sorry, this is a follow-up.
Yeah.
So between the two, the ones that are more geared toward Christian or spirituality versus the ones that are not, I guess which one would you go with?
Which one I go with? Oh, I found wonderful people in both communities, and I found pretty closed-minded people in both communities. I would seek out the wonderful, open-minded people who are eager to help you and who treat you with respect. I think that, like the way you were speaking earlier, you guys are Christian homeschoolers. You wear it on your sleeve. You're not ashamed of it. But it sounds like you're extremely open and welcoming to people of all faiths or no faiths who would be interested in homeschooling. I can't imagine either of you two ever saying, "Oh, sorry, you're not a member of our church. We're not going to talk to you about homeschooling." And I think that as long as you seek out open-minded, tolerant people, you'll be good. Yeah.